gay people, transgender people, etc. Would they make good spies, bad spies, or
well, I mean,
they
have definitely been spies for all kinds. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the film La Tristesse et la Pitié, which is about the French resistance, but this one British gay man had sex with the whole German high command in Paris, and of course that was his job. He was telling them everything they'd been telling him. He told British intelligence.
Well, it makes it quite extraordinary that the MI6 boss was talking this week about actually we've now decided that it's okay. You know, we will allow gays to be in the MI6.
Well, they've been in there for years, so in other words, it's a pretty silly idea. It's like people saying, you know, about the Royal Navy. You know, I mean, the Royal Navy has been full of homosexuality forever. But at the same time, there was a pretense that none of it went on.
Are you saying that we built our empire on homosexuality?
Rum, sodomy and the lash, Tony, as Churchill famously said.
Anyway, so let's have a listen now to the new MI6 chief, Richard Moore, who seems to really crave the spotlight, although, I mean, this in itself is a bit peculiar, isn't it? The idea that the Secret Intelligence Service wants to get as much media coverage as they can.
Well, they are in the game of getting money out of our pockets in order to pursue various agendas of the people that really pull the strings. And one of the strategies they're going to adopt is by coming out and saying, here I am, aren't I glamorous, give us some more money, because as you know, blah, X, Y, we've got all these enemies and you need us, all of that stuff.
Today I want to publicly address an issue from our past and so important to our future for the first time. Same-sex relationships were decriminalised in 1967, but until 1991 there was a security bar to LGBT plus individuals serving in our intelligence agencies because of the misguided view that they would be more susceptible to blackmail than straight people. It meant that until 1991, being openly LGBT plus in MI6 would cause you to lose your job or prevent you from being allowed to join in the first place. Committed, talented, public-spirited people had their careers and lives blighted because it was argued that being LGBT+ was incompatible with being an intelligence professional. Because of this policy, other loyal and patriotic people had their dreams of serving their country in MI6 shattered. This was wrong, unjust and discriminatory. Today, I apologise on behalf of MI6 for the way our LGBT+ colleagues and fellow citizens were treated, and express my regret to those whose lives were affected. Being LGBT+ did not make these people a national security threat. Of course not. But the ban did mean that we, in the intelligence and diplomatic services, deprived ourselves of some of the best talent Britain could offer. Ready to serve, but denied that opportunity.
Well, what he kind of skips over there is the fact the ban didn't really work, did it?
No, I can imagine what went on is that everybody knew that the people were homosexual, but, you know, nobody, basically, they didn't talk, you know, don't talk about it, we won't mention it, and we'll just get on with it. I mean, in a sense, it's bizarre that I mean, it is, I mean, it's hard to know what really goes on, obviously, but, you know, you'd have thought that they would have, I mean, that stuff is just, you can see why they've had to change their public stance on it, because it's just ridiculous.
Yes, so there was actually a former deputy director of MI6 who was, not only was he bisexual, but he was also apparently a child abuser too. So this was caught up in the whole child abuse scandal.
Well, what was his name? The deputy director that was caught with child pornography. I can't remember off the top of my head. But he was never prosecuted. And I think they sound terribly prissy in what he's saying there. But of course, in actual fact, they've been involved in all sorts of manipulative behaviour using sexual means. I mean, that's. I mean, what was the King Cora Boy scandal about? Probably MI5 rather than MI6, but that's what they were up to.
And what was that? The similar sort of operation to the Maxwell Epstein operation? Yes,
it was, and the evidence, and it's well known with it in Northern Ireland. But you know, so people know what happened there. And of course, it wasn't apparently. But boys from Kincora were then taken off to be used as bait in other parts of the country. So it wasn't just in Northern Ireland. And you've got to recognise that this is the kind of thing that intelligence services do. And that doesn't mean they should do them, but they do them.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. There was one of these MI6 guys, and I'll put a link up to that on our show page too, because I think he's implying here that the only problem there with the sexuality of these spies and senior officers in MI6, MI5, etc., was that they were gay. Well, of course, it wasn't, and it also was that they were abusing children, and they were using their national security protection to do so.
Yes, and they also used the abuse of children in their work. That's what the Kincora Boys' Home scandal was all about. MI5 were using those boys as bait to achieve various political objectives. And it's suspected that things were similarly going on in other parts of the country, not just in Northern Ireland. And MI6 coming out of the closet there in that sort of way, they're very much doing perception management, aren't they? They're decent chaps and they're right thinking and all the rest of it. And it's like, well, what is the war in Syria all about? You've been backing these jihadis for years, have ripped the place apart. Any comment to make?
Anyway, this new
General?
New MI6 Director General Chief Richard Moore had this to say about Russia, which he believes is one of the major threats. So they have these various nation threats: China, Russia, and Iran, as well as terrorism. And we'll be hearing about the last three of those now.
We continue to face an acute threat from Russia. My father was posted to Moscow in the 1960s, and my first memories are of Russia. I have a deep respect for Russia's history and culture and people. The current difficult relationship with Russia is not the one the UK wants. But we will do whatever it takes to keep our country safe and to deter and defend against the full spectrum of threats Moscow poses. These include state-sanctioned attacks, such as we have seen in Salisbury and the Czech Republic, interference in democratic processes, such as the attempted coup in Montenegro, cyber attacks, such as the SolarWinds cyber intrusion, which we and our partners publicly attributed to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, or the use of political proxies to undermine stability in the Western Balkans. This activity is on an upward trend. More often than not, these Russian state activities are designed to be covert, or at least deniable. However, we are also seeing more brazen activity, often linked to the personal enrichment of elites around President Putin, the denial of which is increasingly implausible. The deployment of private military companies in Africa and Syria, such as Wagner, is one such example. The poisoning of Alexei Navalny is another. We and our allies and partners must stand up to and deter Russian activity which contravenes the rules-based international system. No country, in Europe or beyond, should be seduced into thinking that unbalanced concessions to Russia bring better behaviour. As the Foreign and Defence Secretaries have made clear in their visits to Ukraine, Moscow should be in no doubt of our support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders, including Crimea. Ukraine is a separate, sovereign country with a separate, sovereign Ukrainian people. Russia, ceasing its destabilising activity, would enable us to focus on common threats and address Russian legitimate interests through dialogue. That dialogue might reassure Russia that, as the Prime Minister noted in his recent Mansion House speech, we have no desire to be adversarial towards Russia, to undermine or encircle it. Meanwhile, my organisation's commitment to understanding Russia and what it is doing has been sustained for a century and will remain a core part of what we do.
Well, that was an interesting but predictable
he says, no, we have no intention of encircling Russia. Well, that doesn't mean to say they're not doing it.
No. I had to actually address very much the same topics last night on RT. because Lavrov had just met with Blinken in Stockholm at the OSCE. That is an incredibly tendentious account of Russia.
But this is the sort of thing which all our MPs will be being briefed on.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, basically, it's basically wrong in virtually every detail. So let's come back. Let's come to the nub of this, which is the Ukraine. In 2014, there was a popular protest movement against the government of Ukraine, the elected government, the Yanukovych government, because instead of signing up for a deal to join the EU at some future point, they decided instead that they would probably sign some kind of trade deal with Russia. And to a younger generation of Ukrainians, that seemed like a betrayal. So they went into the streets to demand that we should be tied to Europe rather than Russia. And at the climax of that, 80-odd of those demonstrators were shot dead by snipers, as were several police officers. There has already been a court case in Kiev where the Berkut riot police were exonerated because evidence was presented by the defence on video from Georgia by the actual snipers, who were a NATO death squad. One of the things that's missing from the MI6 history of the events in Russia is MI6's involvement in things like that. And there has already been a court case in Kiev where this has all come out. MI6 must have known about
it wasn't
that.
MI6 that came out. It was these Georgian snipers.
No,
wasn't
indeed, but MI6 will have known everything about it. In other words, the idea that it's the nasty Russians who do nasty things, we don't do nasty things, is simply wrong. If you go back to Russia in the 1990s, the oligarchic takeover in Russia was orchestrated by Western intelligence services.
So what happened in Ukraine then, as it switched from being more Russian-friendly to being more friendly to Brussels and the United States?
Well, there was actually a big... Ukraine only came into being as a state in 1991. It never existed before in history. And it's basically a hodgepodge. Ukraine, in both Ukrainian and Russian, simply means borderland. Yeah? It's the borderland between Russia and Eastern Europe. And you've got a very big Russian-speaking population in the east of the country who do not think of themselves as Ukrainian at all.
Yeah, but you can't deny that the Russians are doing aggressive operations such as the Salisbury Skripal thing.
Well, Tony, that's a bit of a low, what do you call it, an underarm bowl. Of course, they didn't do that. MI6 are behind all of these operations. What's going on is what's called Operation Beluga. And we know the name of it because Paul Burrell, who's an anti-terrorist squad officer, French anti-terrorist squad officer, has told them this is the name of all of these operations that we see, the Navalny poisoned underpants, the Skripal affair, the shooting down of MH17, which was probably carried out by a plane from the Kiev Air Force, not by any kind of Buk missile at all. Now, what the problem you have in talking to the mainstream politicians in Britain is that they simply do not have the knowledge of what NATO intelligence operations are actually like. They seem to think that if we do things that are slightly iffy, we're still basically on the right side and all the rest of it. And you can see this clearly in the telephone intercept, which came out after the shootings in the Maidan Square, where Urmas Piets, who was the Estonian foreign minister, and the Estonians are very anti-Russian, phones Catherine Ashton, former Labour politician who's the EU's foreign affairs spokesperson, and he picks up the phone to her and he says, I've just been round the hospitals and all these people have been killed by snipers with the same bullets. It's a professional hit, and the doctors are telling me that it's not been carried out by the current regime but by the new regime that's just coming into power. And Catherine Ashton goes, gosh, really? And that's what I feel like saying to Western politicians is, gosh, really, did you know any of that? And the answer is no, because they haven't been told by the BBC or anybody else. They need to know it. And, of course, it's not a one-off. NATO intelligence operations have been steeped in blood for decades, as people in Greece and Italy are very well aware. But people in Britain, of course, still think of MI6 as a sort of gentleman's club.
Yes, and of course the Russians are almost perfect in your eyes. The Russians don't do these dirty tricks that the British do.
No, I'm not saying that they don't, but they're more rational about what they do. Why, for example, would the Russians, in any way, shape or form, try to poison Skripal just before the World Cup kicks off in Russia, which is a big sort of soft power victory for them? The person with the motive for doing that is pretty clear. It's MI6. But Berezovsky, who used to be Putin's sidekick, he broke with Putin and came to the West, and he was very much involved in trying to overthrow Yanukovych and Yevchenko, who was before him, and also to get rid of Putin because he broke with Putin. He became, in the West side, in MI6's eyes, he was the alternative president of Russia living in Britain. He, a few years ago, supposedly committed suicide in his Surrey mansion, except that the local coroner refused to sign it off as suicide because he said that the evidence just doesn't show it's suicide. But who wanted it to be seen as suicide? The British state, led by MI6.
Well,
and that's because the daughter of Berezovsky is quite clear that he was murdered by the British, not by the Russians, by the British.
She was starting to blab a bit too much. Well, there's no blabbing goes on at Sauron's Tower at Vauxhall Cross, and if you look at the picture of the MI6 headquarters, it doesn't exactly look like some sort of nice friendly castle. It looks a bit of a bizarre... Yeah, it looks like something out of the Lord of the Rings and not from the side of Gandalf and Frodo. Anyway, so the Freedom of Information Centre, Martin, confirms that MI6 has disclosed paedophile files on Sir Peter Hayman and another 3 of its spies. Murky waters, they say. That's a nice caption for MI6 headquarters, with the River Thames in the foreground at Vauxhall Cross. And this is Mark Watts, who we've had on our programme, saying this back in 2019, Martin. MI6 has opened up secret files partially on paedophile allegations against its officers and agents for the inquiry into child sexual abuse. The Overseas Intelligence Agency released to the inquiry limited information on Sir Peter Hayman, the late MI6 officer who sometimes worked under diplomatic cover and was an especially dangerous paedophile. But MI6, which adopts a policy of neither confirming nor denying the identity of any staff member below its chief, does not admit that Hayman ever worked as one of its own officers. So they're trying to use that to kind of pathetic little attempt at secrecy.
Do you remember the MI6 officer who committed suicide and then chopped himself into pieces and packed himself into a suitcase?
I think he was working for GCHQ, wasn't he?
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, unbelievable, these sort of suicides.
that was the Russians as well, of course.
Well, actually, funnily enough, they didn't accuse the Russians of that. No. That was just sent out as a kind of scare tactic to people working for the secret services. So don't have any thoughts about doing a Catherine Gunn and talking to the world's press about anything, because you're going to end up chopped up in a little box. So this is really the mafia, isn't it? Let's cut to the chase. This is a mafia tactic.
MI6
they totally disregard the law. They're chopping up people just to send a signal to other people to behave themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the image they're trying to present with this press conference is that they are they want to be seen as the gentlemen of the professionals and all the rest of it. But the history of MI6 is intimately bound up with the history of the CIA, which is bound up with the history of the creation of Al Qaeda, which is bound up with the things like the bombings of Dublin and Monaghan in 1972, the Operation Gladio in Italy and Belgium in the 1940s.
Well, they're also fueling something right now, which is this conflict between Israel and Iran.
And also this conflict with Russia, democratic Russia, where they hold free elections and Putin wins, and that's no good. We've got to do something to stop it.
Just carrying on with Mark Watts' article from the foiacentre.com. I'll put a link up to this on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. It says, following Hayman's death, this is Sir Peter Hayman, the paedophile MI6, who wasn't mentioned just now by the new Director General of MI6. He's Richard Moore, not quite Sir Richard Moore yet, but I'm sure he's hoping to join the Sirs. Following Hayman's death, one MI6 colleague noted on his file that he was an unpleasant and pompous man who liked playing Father Christmas so that he could move children up and down on his knee.
Yes, well, I mean, the point is that the idea that these people were sexual perverts, but they're being protected by the system, is the furthest that you will find mainstream politicians going. The real problem is that MI6 is integrated into the CIA's global power trip. And of course, the CIA has been involved in things like drug dealing, assassinations, and we are implicated in all of this. And of course, MI6 were the lead agency on Operation Cyclone that created Al-Qaeda initially to fight in Afghanistan. And the reason why MI6 were given that role is because of the role of the British Empire in having basically sovereignty over many Muslim countries. They got a lot more contacts on the ground in those countries than the US had. And we've been doing this for years and years and years, and we've been, the jihadi terrorism of which we've all, been subjected to, orchestrated from within the Western intelligence service structure.
I put it to you,
the Saudi Arabians are our closest allies. Yeah,
closer than Israel.
They're about the same, and that's why we're in the mess we're in.
I put it to you, Martin, that actually MI6 is playing quite an important role here in trying to get a war started, actually, over in the Middle East between Iran and Israel.
And in the Ukraine, yeah.
Yeah, so in a way, they're both the same war, aren't they? Because the Russians are generally backing Iran, and so by having a go at Russia and Iran, what they're doing is they're dividing the world into a potential flashpoint situation.
What they're doing is they are determined to prevent the growth of a multipolar world order. Yeah, there's nothing in, I'm 62 years old tomorrow, and I can't see any reason why the liberal West can't rub along with the democratizing Russia, which is actually moving in the right direction, whereas countries like the US are moving in the wrong direction, and a newly modernizing China. I mean, one of the things that's happened with the COVID crisis is that Chinese tourism has been prevented, but millions of Chinese, middle-class Chinese, have been travelling all over the world, visiting all over the world, taking, behaving like tourists and going home to prosper. Yeah. In the past.
And taking photographs of British military installations.
Well, indeed, but the point is that if it was such a repressive place, why are all these rather well-heeled tourists travelling all over the world and then going home? They're going home because it's the place they want to be.
Well, the reason, okay, Martin, all I'm saying is that we do this programme here in Bristol, in England. We would not be able to do this in Hong Kong or anywhere else in China, would we? We wouldn't be able to speak our minds.
We wouldn't be able to do it in Saudi Arabia either.
No.
And of course, it's the UK Lawyers for Israel that tried to take us off BCFM. That sort of argument.
When they failed, Marvin Rees, the mayor's mate, Pat Hart, who was the BCFM boss, did it for them.
Well, but that's a wormhole, really. To be honest, I mean, the fact is that our right to freedom of speech is very, very limited anyway, as we know from looking at Julian Assange and all the rest of it. And, of course, people being murdered by the government. In Northern Ireland, the state has been involved in large numbers of murders.
Well, look, say something.
People they don't like have been disappeared.
Let's say something positive, because Craig Murray's come out of jail this week, and he was, of course, doing a lot of the reporting on the original Julian Assange hearing earlier this year.
Yes. And, more power to his elbow. And, of course, Craig Murray was as an ex-British diplomat with Russian experience, very, very sceptical of the whole Skripal nonsense.
Now he's done 8 months in jail. Do you think he can start behaving himself, Mr. Murray?
I doubt it.
No, I doubt it too. Anyway, let's move on now to the next clip from the MI6's boss, Director General Richard Moore, where he talks about the threats from Iran.
In the context of the state-level challenge, we remain actively focused on Iran. Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the Iranian leadership has embraced an explicit doctrine of conflict with both Israel and the West. Indeed, we deeply regret that a country with an almost unparalleled depth of history and culture, such as Iran, has been the source of instability across the region and beyond for over 40 years. Hezbollah, incubated in Lebanon by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Force, was Iran's first foreign insurgent force. It has since grown to become a state within a state, contributing directly to state weakness and political turmoil in Lebanon. Iran has repeated the model in Iraq, where it has exploited a fragile transition to democracy to seed the country with armed gangs who are undermining the state from within, murdering those who seek to uphold the law. This month, one of those Iranian armed and trained gangs attempted to kill the Iraqi Prime Minister. We see attempts to pursue similar policies in Syria, Yemen and the Gulf. Iran has also built up a substantial cyber capability, which it has used against its regional rivals as well as countries in Europe and North America, and maintains an assassination program which it uses against regime opponents. There are many parallels with the challenge that Russia poses, and it is no coincidence that the two countries have made common cause in Syria. As the Foreign Secretary has made clear, we will continue to work to contain the threat posed by Iran to the UK directly and to our allies in the region. That includes contesting Iran's development of nuclear technology, which has no conceivable civilian use. Yesterday, negotiations resumed in Vienna, which could provide a path back to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or nuclear deal, between Iran and the West. That would be in the interest of Iran, the region, and the world. We all want a diplomatic outcome.
Well, what I find interesting about this is, as the head of our spy agency, he ought to be basically saying, well, we're just keeping an eye on things. It's for the politicians to decide the policy. But what I'm hearing here is, this is our policy. Iran is our enemy. And I just think that's a completely... it's extraordinarily...
Well, no, he's just being realistic. He's saying Iran is the source of all these problems. I mean, he's saying, look, I mean, he's doing his analysis. He's saying Iran is the source of instability. It's the source of Hezbollah, which is destroying Lebanon. It's also running groups in Iraq, these gangs in Iraq who are doing assassinations, plus in Syria and Yemen and in the Gulf states. They're also basically running terrorist groups in those countries.
And so are the British. In Syria. The British have been killing loads of people in Syria, but we're not going to mention that. In actual fact, the attempt to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria has killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. And that's not Iran's fault, that's our fault. We did that. We are in alliance with the Saudis to wreck Yemen. And we are basically far more violent. Don't forget that the Iranian Revolution in 1979 came about because of our coup d'etat carried out by our MI6 in 1954, which put Mossadegh, who'd nationalised British Petroleum, into house arrest and put the Shah of Iran in charge.
So it was a blowback?
Yes. We basically... in Iran, people very well know what role Britain has played in turning the place into a miserable, times a miserable place. Don't forget, we supported Saddam throughout his years-long war against the Iranian Revolution, with plenty of cheering from us. And I think that the idea that somehow they are an evil force that we've got to resist, on behalf of the Israelis, of course, who are the real destabilising force in the Middle East. The Iranians have been there for thousands of years. The Israelis arrived the day before yesterday, and they're the ones with the nuclear weapons that they shouldn't have. This is incredibly partial. I mean, I would have liked to have thought that somebody who was the head of MI6 would have had a very nuanced view. Yeah? What I'm getting from this isn't a nuanced view. This is a series of tub-thumping, jingoistic statements. You know, I don't sense anything in there which suggests that they've got anything other than a kind of, a bonehead agenda.
This is kind of a narrative which is spread right across government. It's kind of come from places like the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and
they talk to each other all the time.
Infiltrating the intelligence services. This narrative is also gaining credence in the Foreign Office. I noticed when Dominic Raab spoke out about the Royal Navy being used over in Crimea to provoke the Russians by sailing into their waters. He was then moved out of the Foreign Office. So the idea is, if you say anything against this narrative, that you're not going to be in government for more than 5 seconds. Your feet won't touch the floor.
Well, one would like to have thought that the intelligence services would be a place of intelligence where they understand that the world's a complicated place. And that the Iranians...
What is their agenda here? Because,
what their agenda here is quite clear. A, they want more money for the intelligence services. Let's face it, that's what we're after here. And also, of course, they are the mouthpieces for the military-industrial complex. We need to have enemies, otherwise why would we want to waste all this money on weaponry?
Traditionally, the intelligence arms of, say, the Army, the Air Force, etc., what they do is they do kind of targeting, don't they? And they also make sure that in a fight, in a battle, that in a physical battle, or whether it's an economic battle or whatever, that they have identified where the real targets are, and they've isolated people who are working against them, so that they, to decrease loss of life amongst active service personnel. That's what the intelligence service are there to do, supposedly.
Well, I mean, that's a very kind of
Well, it's no point having a fight using an army or an air force or a navy unless you know where your enemy is and how to destroy them.
Well, in other words, there is, intelligence services are there and they've got various roles. But I mean, for example, when he's talking about Hezbollah destabilising Lebanon, it's absurd. The Israelis invaded Lebanon in living, they've bombed Beirut. They've destabilised all of their neighbours completely. Syria has been completely destabilised by us and the Israelis
Lebanon,
and the Turks.
There is an economic war on Lebanon going on.
That's right. And that's because this is all ultimately about the state of Israel and the US imperialism. And we are loyal little bulldogs, aren't we? I mean, this is all I'm getting from all of this. He comes across as an opinionated bulldog. Yeah.
And also a puppet of the Americans and the Israelis. Which is worrying when you've got all these London think tanks, plus the Foreign Office and the Secret Intelligence Service, all singing from the same hymn sheet and seeing the same enemies who actually aren't really our enemies at all. We're turning them into our enemies by repeating the lie.
Exactly right.
Repeating the lie again and again and again.
And even if they were your enemies, your job, I would say, is to understand why they are your enemies.
I mean, you've got this JC...
Why have they got this hostile attitude towards
He mentioned Vienna there, and this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. He doesn't seem to have any interest in getting that signed.
No, he's saying that he wants it signed, but of course he's not coming to the nub of the matter, which is it could be signed tomorrow if the Americans were willing to sign it, but they're not. And he didn't mention that. It's not the Iranians who don't want to sign up for it. They signed up for it and they were agreed to do it. It's the Americans who then decided they're going to rip it up.
I mean, I called it the most important piece of paper on the planet, actually, that would stop a Third World War.
Well, it's becoming increasingly irrelevant because they're not going to sign it. There is pressure.
Biden said he was going to sign it last year before he got elected.
But what he said then is we're not going to sign it unless the Iranians get rid of their missile program.
I don't think he did say that.
No, he did. No. He said we're willing to renegotiate. The Iranians have been pretty clear, and they're not in Vienna. They're not actually directly talking to each other. So the Americans sit in one room, the Iranians sit in another room, and then other people have to be told, tell the Americans so and so, and then the other Americans say to the Iranians, tell them so and so, because they're not actually talking to each other. Because the Iranians have said quite categorically, we're not talking to you directly at all until you just sign up what you've already signed. A bit like Boris and Brexit. You've signed the deal. You've signed it. Don't say you want to renegotiate it. You either sign it, you can come back into the deal you've already signed, and we can discuss things. Otherwise, we're not interested to talk to you. And ultimately, of course, what they're talking about is a war with Iran, which Iran will win. In their own home turf, they will be defeated. The same thing would happen in the Ukraine if it turns to a war. The same thing will happen over Taiwan. As Scott Ritter, the former US Marine, was saying, we've got no way to defend Taiwan. If the Chinese decide to take it, they will take it. And of course, this is the danger. I can see the situation now very similar to the run-up to World War I, where all of this kind of tub-thumping rhetoric ultimately leads to some lower-level person making a poor decision, and the whole thing just goes boom. Absolutely, and I don't hear any sense about that at all. It's boilerplate stuff. There's no kind of nuance of any kind, is there?
Looking at the New York Times, a couple of articles relating to this. Martin Biden promised to restore the Iran nuclear deal. Now it risks derailment because since the election of the new president at the beginning of this year, he's been shifting the goalposts, Biden.
Well, he's been told to shift the goalposts by his masters, who are the military-industrial complex and the Israelis. They basically do not want peace with Iran. They want a war with Iran. They've been pretty clear about that all along. And people in this country say, well, the Israelis are such a nice country and we've just got to help them because they're the only democracy in the Middle East. And say, do you want a war with Iran? And the answer is, if you do, then you're going to have one.
Okay,
and whether you'll like it or not is another matter.
Also, Israel and Iran are broadening the cyber war to attack civilian targets. This is reported in the New York Times.
This is projection.
This week. Well, hang on. Hear us out. Iranians couldn't buy petrol. Gas, they say in the New York Times. Israelis found their intimate dating details posted online. The Iran-Israel shadow war is now hitting ordinary citizens. This is according to Ronan Bergman, who wrote the Rise Up and Kill First book a few years ago. He's writing here in the New York Times, millions of ordinary people in Iran and Israel recently found themselves caught in the crossfire of a cyber war between their countries. In Tehran, a dentist drove around for hours in search of gasoline, waiting in long lines at 4 stations only to come away empty. Sounds like here, doesn't it, during the party conference season. Being punished by the big oil companies like they do to third world countries.
This was a cyber attack.
And in Tel Aviv, a well-known broadcaster panicked as the intimate details of his sex life and those of hundreds of thousands of others stolen from an LGBTQ dating site were uploaded on social media. For years, Ronan says, Israel and Iran have engaged in a covert war by land, sea and air and computer, but the targets have usually been military. Now the cyber war has widened to target civilians on a large scale.
Yes, and that's not the Iranians, is it? That is the Israelis doing it to them. And
well, no, hang on. He's saying it's both of them. That the Iranians are also getting these details of LGBTQ dating details and putting them online.
I thought that what you were saying there, that they were doing that inside Iran. Yeah? You think you need to get...
No, the LGBTQ dating site is an Israeli one, which apparently, according to Ronan Bergman, the Iranians have hacked that and put it all online.
Well, listen, I'm quite sure there is hacking going on all around the place, but the Iranians have been noticeably the victims of hacking.
Well, what
there's constant hacking attacks. The Stuxnet virus, which closed down Bushire, the Israelis and the Americans openly boasted that they created that virus. Openly boasted it, and of course it possibly played a role because it escaped from Iran in the breakdown at Fukushima later on. And of course, lots and lots of Iranian nuclear scientists have been assassinated out of hand.
Well, over in Iran, amazingly, I mean,
bomb attacks have taken place inside Iran. You remember you went to a conference in Iran about terrorism inside Iran, carried out by Iran's enemies, the Saudis, the Israelis, the British, and the Americans.
Tens of thousands of terrorist victims, actually.
That's right.
In this latest incident, they say petrol pumps suddenly stopped working, and a digital message on the pump directed customers to complain to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Yes, I mean, it's blatant stuff, isn't it? That's like the mafia going around
displaying the phone number of his office on the petrol pump.
Yes, so in other words, it's blatant attempt to force the population to rise up against the regime, which they basically, whatever second thoughts they have elections in which a majority participate, and the regime represents to some extent the feelings of the ordinary people, unlike in Saudi Arabia.
The hackers took control of billboards in big cities like Tehran and Isfahan, replacing the ads up on those billboards, these are digital ones, with the message, Khamenei, where is my gasoline? At 11 a.m, suddenly, the pumps stopped working. Well, I like that 11 a.m. This is Joachim and Boaz, the two big Masonic pillars. They love 11. Said Moshen, the manager of a gas station in northern Tehran. I have never seen anything like this. And amazing to also be able to take over these billboards. Like we've got here in Bristol now, these hideous billboards on the way into the city on the M32, which I don't think should be there because they distract the drivers. But, to imagine being able to hack one of those and put your own message on there, whatever it happens to be.
A question pops into my mind. We know that the Israelis have been involved in these cyber attacks on Iran. And we've had the head of MI6 there saying, we have got to do more on cyber warfare in relation to Iran. Have MI6 been involved in these illegal? Because all of this action is absolutely illegal under international law. You're not supposed to do stuff like that, are you?
No one gets killed in these attacks, apparently.
Well, they do, don't they, indirectly? Yes. What about the ambulances that can't get... Don't forget that Iran is under sanctions. So even the COVID crisis and all the rest of it, people do any trade or aid with Iran are sanctioned.
Well,
the economy has been driven into the floor in order to try and overthrow the regime, which is seen as a threat to the state of Israel and to Western power in the Middle East and all the rest of it.
I see this as really the latest iteration of this Our Pike plan, which is in order to try and get the Zionists and the Islamic Republic to have a massive war. The idea really being to, get Jews and Muslims fighting each other, and the whole world looks at it and says, oh, isn't this terrible? It's religion starting a war again. It's a bit like Northern Ireland, which actually had nothing to do with religion, really.
Look, I mean, you're making quite a few logical leaps there. The religion is important in all sorts of ways, and in social the conditions are important, politics is important, the economics are important. Iran has been a victim country of the British Empire and going back to the 19th century. People in Iran well know this. They well know it.
But
people in this country are
the initiative in this conflict, as it's developed over the last decades, has all been from the West, from the Zionist Empire.
That's right. The Iranians, all the Iranians did in 1979.
I'm saying the object is to create a religious war and to discredit the whole idea of religion.
No, it's not to discredit the idea of religion. What they're doing is that Iran has got oil. That's why we went in there in the first place. That's why we overthrew Mossadegh.
We don't want any oil anymore. We're having wind power.
Well, listen, they do. Well, what they would love Iranian oil to be on the world market, provided they control it. They do not want the regime to be able to sell its oil, because then they could give the people some development.
Yeah, but they can't because they're under sanctions, can't
Well,
they?
that's right. But ultimately, what's actually happened is that there was a massive trade deal done between the Chinese and the Iranians, and also between the Iraqis and the Chinese. And the world is moving on. You can say you're not going to buy their oil, well, somebody else will. And the Chinese, they've not been able to put sanctions on China for doing that, because if they do that, then China will start putting sanctions on them.
Well, they end
and
up
the
with
Chinese,
nothing on their supermarket shelves.
And indeed, and also, don't forget, the Chinese hold the US national debt. Yeah? So there's a lot of bluff involved in all of this.
Anyway, the fourth thing that we had China, Russia and Iran, and the fourth major thing that the MI6 chief, Richard Moore, came up with in his wonderful speech, and we'll be hearing his couple more clips from this in a minute, is international terrorism.
The fourth and final of the big four challenges I referred to is the threat from international terrorism. We retain an intense focus on developing new agent relationships and technological capabilities needed to degrade existing terrorist groups, prevent their spread, and identify unknown threats. To do this, MI6 continues to recruit agents in the most dangerous organizations in the world. We benefit from outstanding cooperation with our colleagues in MI5 and GCHQ and from our international partners. In the last 20 years, the UK intelligence community as a whole has disrupted dozens of overseas attack plans before they could reach the UK, saving potentially thousands of lives. However, Al-Qaeda, Daesh and their affiliates and imitators retain an undiminished appetite for violence and the inflicting of mass casualties, and the world still presents fertile ground for radicalization. Terrorist networks have spread in the Middle East, the Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Horn of Africa, and beyond. Counterterrorism work is more difficult in a more fragmented world, with rising internal conflicts, some states regressing in economic development as a result of conflict, and the diffusion of technologies making it easier for terrorists to conceal their planning. The homegrown threat of terrorism, with the attendant difficulty of disrupting lone wolf attacks, means that, sadly, some attacks are always likely to get through. Furthermore, there is no doubt about the morale boost the Taliban victory in Afghanistan has given to the extremist movement globally, as well as its potential emboldening effect on countries such as Russia, China, and Iran. I mentioned before that MI6 deals with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. Nowhere is that sentiment more relevant than in Afghanistan. I am immensely proud of the contribution MI6 officers made to the Afghan mission and to preventing Al-Qaeda from carrying out another attack on the scale of 9/11. But I won't soft-soap it. The threat we face will likely grow now we have left Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda and Daesh will seek to increase their foothold and to rebuild their ability to strike Western targets. Our priority, as the Prime Minister has said, is to stop the re-emergence of large-scale international terrorist operations from a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, and to protect the UK homeland and our citizens from any threat that might emanate from there. As an intelligence community, we will now do this outside in, working from the outside to identify and disrupt any threats from a resurgent Al-Qaeda. This is an extremely difficult task, and will rely extensively on regional partnerships as well as coordination with our allies. At the same time, we are engaging with the Taliban and testing their willingness to cooperate. It is also the job of my service to provide the independent secret intelligence from our sources to illuminate this murky scene. With our allies, we will be ready to disrupt al-Qaeda if the Taliban renege on their promises not to allow al-Qaeda to rebuild external operations capability and to tackle the threat from Daesh.
Well, I mean, this is the nub of what they've been pushing for years, isn't it? This Islamist conspiracy out there, which was created by them in the first place. I mean, you'd think we made a mistake in the 1980s when we set up Al-Qaeda with our Saudi friends and our Pakistani military.
Robin Cook wrote about this in The Guardian and died very shortly afterwards.
Yes. So, I mean, what's missing from this is any introspection. Where did Al-Qaeda come from, Director General? Who started it?
Well, funnily enough, there is no Q&A session at the end of this.
No, well, there wouldn't be, would there? So again, what we're getting, this is the military-industrial complex's, view of the world. Yeah. And of course, we need more money. We infiltrate all of these organisations. And of course, as we know, inside Syria, we actually ran many of them. And, the Free Syrian Army, all of their weaponry ended up in the hands of Daesh and ISIS.
Can you just give me some evidence that something that was going on in Syria with ISIS, etc., was the British? It was MI6, was, this is Richard Moore's little baby?
Well, the evidence is overwhelming. There were rat lines running into Syria, and the Western intelligence services were servicing those rat lines. They removed people from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in Libya into Syria and then moved them back into Libya. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is basically the bomber in Manchester was from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, have an intimate relationship with MI6 going back to the 1980s. Many Libyans went through the hands of MI6 and the Pakistani intelligence services into Afghanistan, and now the Taliban have taken over in Afghanistan. They're trying to, there is basically the British Empire is appearing out of the speech we're hearing, isn't it? We're supposed to be a tiny country in Europe, getting on with our business, fixing the railways, but instead we're in Afghanistan, we're in China, we're everywhere because that's where we've always been. Because the British Empire isn't dead. I mean, when people say I don't think what their views of the British Empire are, what I say is the problem with history is it's not even history.
So when the next
we're still running it,
Martin. When the next bomb, I mean, admittedly this is MI5, not MI6 territory, but the next bomb goes off in Britain, like a Manchester Arena bomb, which is blamed on Al Qaeda or whatever, some Islamist group. Who will have planted it?
It depends, doesn't it? He mentioned 9/11 there. And, of course, that's just a tick box. And, of course, the 9/11 attack, which we all know was carried out by Al-Qaeda, except, as you and I know, and anybody who listens to this show knows, the evidence is overwhelming that it wasn't carried out by Al-Qaeda.
Well, insofar as it actually does their research.
That's right. And I'll tell you who will have been doing their research: the Iranian general staff, the Russian general staff, the Chinese general staff and their intelligence services. So it's the Iranians, the Secret Service, for example, who pointed out that all the people on the plane that supposedly crashed at Shanksville were working for the Pentagon. Every single one of them.
That sounds a little bit like Operation Northwoods, dreamt up by Lemnitzer in the 1960s.
Indeed.
Which was, the idea was to get a load of military people to book onto a plane as if they were civilians, and then shoot another plane down, an identical plane down, and say, oh, isn't it terrible, all these people are dead, and we're going to have to invade Cuba now.
That's right. And everybody knows that the CIA gets involved in things like that. They overthrew Allende. But recently came to light that the British intelligence services, MI6, were involved in the overthrow of Sukarno in Indonesia, which then led to the mass murder of up to 500,000 communist sympathisers. Henry
Kissinger had his finger in that part.
Yes, but MI6 had their finger in there as well. I think what they want to present themselves as is some kind of liberal defenders of the liberal world order, when in actual fact they're steeped in blood.
What about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba?
Well, again, MI6. Now, you'd have thought somebody who was going to come clean about MI6 would say, I'm going to tell you, yes, in the past we did all these terrible things, but we've changed. We're a different organisation. we're sensitive to the nuance of world affairs. We realise that the Iranians have got legitimate reason to feel hostile to Britain.
There seems to be a complete inability,
You can't hear any of that.
There seems to be a complete inability of the government, particularly, but also, in this case, the intelligence services at the very top, to be in any way self-critical. So everything is everyone else's fault, never theirs.
That's right.
And they never do anything wrong. It's always someone else.
Yeah, well, they will admit that I am only human and etc. But it's still the fundamentals are wrong. I mean, the organisation shouldn't really exist in its current form. It just shouldn't be there.
He's saying it absolutely must exist in this dangerous world. But, I mean, we know, don't we, after, for example, the First World War and other large wars, the intelligence services were largely wound down. And after World War II, the Cold War kicking in meant that they carried on.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to having an intelligence service, but what it ought to be is a very discreet way of finding out what's going on, not a player. This is what Truman said about the CIA. He said, I want an intelligence service. I mean, that means I want people to tell me what other people are thinking and so on. But I don't want them making policy.
With a weak government,
this is the intelligence service making policy.
With a weak, denuded government, with selected MPs selected to be, shall we say, a little bit slow, the intelligence, which is the permanent government, are basically running the show.
Yes, and they, of course, are answerable to others. They don't. The idea that they're the only people in charge would be wrong.
Boris.
They all end up running in the banking system.
Boris just ticks the box, doesn't he? Ticks the box for an easy life.
Well, he's obviously not in charge.
Clearly not.
Whereas this chap thinks he is.
Anyway, so one of the other, I thought, really worrying aspects to this was this wonderful partnership that MI6 are now doing with the big tech giants that we know are crooked and corrupt and evil, like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and the rest of them. All these big tech giant companies, it seems that they're now flavour of the month. Now, I think it was the latest Johnny English film which portrayed this in a rather alarming manner. Maybe we should, instead of listening to what Richard Moore has got to say about big tech partnerships, we should be watching Rowan Atkinson and Johnny English explaining it far better in fictional terms. But anyway, let's have a listen to the MI6 Director General Richard Moore describing their now very important relationship with the tech giants.
Our adversaries are pouring money and ambition into mastering artificial intelligence, quantum computing and synthetic biology, because they know that mastering these technologies will give them leverage. An intelligence service needs to be at the vanguard of what is technologically possible. This is not new. We've always been at the leading edge of innovation, from the chemistry that enabled us to produce secret writing technologies in the early days of the service, to the wireless and secure speech technologies we developed during the Second World War. And today we are founding members of the National Cyber Force, the UK's unified cyber command, which conducts cyber operations to counter state threats, terrorists and criminals, and to support military deployment. What is new is that we are now pursuing partnerships with the tech community to help develop world-class technologies to solve our biggest mission problems. We can't match the scale and resources of the global tech industry, so we shouldn't try. Instead, we should seek their help. Through the National Security Strategic Investment Fund, we are opening up our mission problems to those with talent in organisations that wouldn't normally work with national security. Unlike Q in the Bond movies, we cannot do it all in-house.
Well, the film was Johnny English Strikes Again, Martin, and what it portrays is these Dracula-like bosses from the tech giants like Facebook, etc., charming the British politicians and getting them to sort of, they want to have their photograph taken with the boss of Facebook. The idea is that they actually love just being in the same room as these people because some of their amazing kudos and their technical genius will rub off to them and result in votes.
Well, I mean, that's a kind of generalised critique, if you like, of the tech industry. But, I mean, when he's talking there about, we're going to bring the private sector in, they've been in there all along. If you think about it, the National Security Agency in the United States of America was working with people like Bill Gates and all the Zuckerberg and all these others all along. Those are the people to whom they really are answerable. and it's a kind of public-private partnership. I would argue that something like MI6, it wouldn't be MI6. We'd have to have something completely new, in my view, which would operate.
MI7?
Well, I think we just
with Rowan Atkinson running it.
You've got ultimately you've got to think about disbanding these organisations completely and putting something else in its place. They are far too big for their boots. They are basically making policy. All of the things he's talking about are essentially politically disputable. Yeah, these people, they are adversaries. Why are they our adversaries? Because you want them to be our adversaries. That's what's going on here.
Anyway,
of course,
I thoroughly recommend people to watch Johnny English Strikes Again. I think it's 2018. I went to see it in the cinema, and absolutely rip-roaring fun. But it shows, Martin, that actually the senior partners here are not the intelligence service. They are actually the tech giants who they are using the intelligence services basically as one of their operational arms out on the ground.
I think what you've got is a fusion within the elites and a revolving door between private sector wealth and power and the public sector, which supposedly serves the common interest. This interest, the foreign policy which he's outlining there, is one of confrontation with the developing world and with Russia. And that is a political choice. It's not the
he's portraying it as that they're reacting to these attacks by Russia, for example, in Salisbury.
But to my mind, Tony, and it should be to any right-thinking person, the Salisbury affair is an MI6 operation from start to finish. It's not a Russian operation. And what they're doing by carrying out operations like that, and the bombing of Bologna railway station in 1980, or Piazza Fontana in 1969, or Dublin and Monaghan in 1972, is they are moulding the mind of the population to war. That is what they do. What were the white helmets doing in Syria with British taxpayer money? They were waving bloody shrouds and claiming that chemical weapons attacks were being carried out, which were actually being carried out by the jihadis we were working with. And we financed that as well. And the purpose of all of that is to get a loop going where politicians in Britain are forced to do something about Syria, which we are using our resources to wreck.
Look, I'm dragging you back to Salisbury again, because surely the connection there was with a guy called Christopher Steele, not with MI6 and Sergei Skripal.
Christopher Steele was an ex-MI6 agent, wasn't he? He was actually Skripal's handler when and Skripal himself was working for MI6 when he was supposedly attacked in the way he was supposedly attacked. The Russian secret services are pretty professional. And what's actually happened is because of the history of Russia, where the intelligence services became ridiculously powerful, they are much more responsible to political power than they are here. You know, I mean, if in Britain we've just passed a law through Parliament with the 80-seat majority on 43% of the vote that the intelligence services, the military and the police should be above the law. Now, if you tried to bring something like that before the Parliament in Russia, they would boot it out. The whole political spectrum would say, what are you on about? But in this country, they've just got it through Parliament.
It does seem like, this is a colossal conspiracy, actually, to make sure that
the 9/11 attack was carried out from inside the US security forces.
A whole load of people that don't think for themselves put in positions of power, and they refuse to think for themselves.
No, they think for themselves, but they haven't got the best interests of the ordinary population.
What they do is they just read from the script, effectively.
Well, he may be just reading from the script, but nevertheless, I mean, what's missing from that? If the intelligence services in Britain were any good, they would have realised that the 9/11 attack was an inside job, and they'd have been spending the last 20 years trying to bring the people behind it to book. I mean, but in actual fact, they're implicated, aren't they?
Ultimately, the whole democratic system is discredited by people like this, and the people rubbing their hands in the background, as I say quite regularly on this programme, are the big corporations. They say, well, of course, as soon as this whole edifice crumbles, we're here to take over. Anyway, let's have a listen now to the final clip, which is the clapometer clip, to see how well Richard Moore, the Director General of MI6, does here with his audience. And also, there's an interesting a few words appear at the very end.
There is no doubt that we face unprecedented international challenges, but we are a resilient nation, we are an influential nation, with outstanding military, intelligence and diplomatic capabilities. And we are a creative, innovative nation with immense soft power derived from our values, our history and our culture. We should have every confidence that we can seize the opportunities of the 21st century and navigate our country successfully through it. And our service, MI6, will be at the forefront of that national journey. Thank you.
Okay, two out of 10, maybe.
Richard, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard, for a really wide-ranging speech. I hope there's a confidence-building measure taking.
A confidence-building measure. That's what apparently this MI6 speech is, a confidence-building measure.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that he's come and made a speech like that, which is so tendentiously political. I would have thought the role of MI6, if it were to be performing its role properly, is to actually be telling the people in power the uncomfortable truths about their so-called enemies, that they may in fact have a point, rather than just they are out to get us and we need more money to stop them. I mean, it's just so poor.
The MI5, Martin, what about these? I mean, we've just seen this week National Action's Ben Raymond there being jailed this week. He wanted to have something called a white jihad, and it does seem as if the intelligence services might be involved in these sorts of operations. Maybe people like Tommy Robinson, that sort of thing. Would they have an interest, do you think, in that?
Well, what they did in Italy in the Strategia di Tensione, SISMI, and of course MI6 are allies with SISMI, is that they run both left-wing and right-wing terrorists. And they used to say in Italy that the right-wing terrorists were glove puppets and the left-wing terrorists were marionettes who didn't necessarily realise that they were being run. And I think MI6 has engaged in exactly the same kind of strategy of tension in Britain. The jihadi violence, which, I mean, they ought to admit, if they put their hands up and said, yes, in the 1980s, we did create an organisation called Al-Qaeda to fight in Afghanistan, and we did train them up, and we did send them there, and we showed them how to kill soldiers and blow things up, and now they turned on us in 9/11 and we don't know what to do, help, then you'd say, well, that's an honest appraisal.
Well,
there is no honesty, because they won't look back to that period.
It seems to me
because it just begs the question: are they still running these jihadi terrorist organisations?
It seems to me, Martin, evil people like Victor Rothschild had such a lot of fun in the Second World War running things like the Double Cross organisation and the Fifth Column, that they decided to make sure they carried it on right the way through up into the 1990s. I think he died in 1990, Victor Rothschild, but the Double Cross organisation in the Second World War was a whole bunch of people who were secretly working for the British. They'd been turned, sending largely good but occasionally and importantly duff information over to Germany. And the Fifth Column was run by the British, but they were attracting lots and lots of people who had pro-Nazi sympathies. So they were obviously demonstrably going out there being pro-Nazi. And I wonder whether this National Action isn't something rather like the second of these two.
Well, you can be pretty certain that all these kind of groups are being watched and infiltrated, and then they're going to be used in various ways. It depends on what SISMI were doing in Italy. Was they're trying to destabilise the democratic progress of the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, and that was the ultimate goal. And they were prepared to kill large numbers of people to achieve that goal. And they were working closely with the CIA and with MI6. MI6 is an organisation which has basically got lots and lots of blood on its hands, which is why I would say you ultimately have to disband it and create another organisation.